The box hit the floor of the apartment hallway at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. Not thrown, not dropped accidentally. Set down, deliberately, forcefully, the way a man sets something down when he's run out of words. The thud echoed through the third floor of their building in East Atlanta, and the neighbor's dog started barking somewhere down the hall. Caleb Jordan stood over that box in his work shirt, still damp at the collar from 12 hours on a warehouse floor, staring at the furniture he'd spent the last 4 Saturdays refinishing by hand. A walnut side table, sanded smooth, stained the color of dark coffee, legs re-lathed and re-bolted. $83 in materials, listed online for $280. He'd just gotten the notification. Buyer canceled. From somewhere in that light came the soft ping of a laptop, Danny's laptop, and the faint sound of her laughing at something on a call. It was almost midnight. She was still on a work call. She'd been on them every night that week. Caleb straightened up, picked the box back up, carried the table back inside without a word. He didn't know it yet. Couldn't have known it then. But that quiet moment in the hallway, that canceled sale, that laugh from the other room, it was the first domino. And the ones behind it had already started to lean. Caleb Jordan was 30 years old and 6 months into being a husband. That's how he thought of it. Like it was a job he'd applied for, gotten, and was now trying not to get fired from. He was a floor supervisor at a regional distribution warehouse on the south side of Atlanta, which meant he was responsible for 23 workers, a quarterly inventory that never balanced right, and a manager named Dennis who communicated almost exclusively through passive-aggressive group emails. The work was physical, the pay was decent, not great. The hours were long and unpredictable, and every time Caleb thought he was getting ahead, some equipment broke down, or someone called out, or overtime dried up without notice. But he had a plan. He always had a plan. The plan was the house. He and Danielle had a joint savings account with $14,200 in it. Their target was $40,000, enough for a down payment on something real, something with a yard, maybe a garage where he could do his furniture work properly, instead of hunched over a drop cloth in their third-floor hallway. 2 more years, he figured. 2 years of discipline, side hustle, no unnecessary spending. He'd built a spreadsheet. He'd printed it out and taped it inside the kitchen cabinet door. He hadn't told Danny about the side hustle, not because he was hiding it, or that's what he told himself, but because he wanted to surprise her with the number when it got big enough. He didn't want her to know yet how hard he was trying to catch up. Catch up. That was the word that had started living in the back of his mind around 8 months ago, right around the time Danny got her promotion. Danielle Jordan was 29, and she was good at her job the way some people are quietly, devastatingly good at things, without making a production of it. She worked as a marketing manager at a mid-size firm in Midtown, the kind of place with exposed brick walls and a coffee bar on every floor, and she had a talent for taking a brand's fuzzy idea of itself and turning it into something people actually wanted to be near. She'd been climbing steadily for 3 years. Then, 8 months ago, she'd been handed a full account team to lead. Salary bump, new title on her business card, a corner office, well, a desk near a window, which in that building amounted to the same thing. She'd cried when she got the news, happy crying. She'd called Caleb first, before her mother, before her best friend Simone, before anyone. He'd told her he was proud of her, and he meant it, completely, in that moment. It was only later, much later, when the congratulations from her coworkers stopped and the new normal settled in, that the other feeling crept up on him. The one he didn't have a clean name for. The one that showed up every time someone at a family gathering asked Danny about her job and her eyes lit up and the table leaned in. The one that showed up when he checked the joint account and saw her direct deposit and then saw his. The 4th of July cookout at Caleb's Aunt Gloria's house in Decatur was the kind of event that looked like a celebration and functioned like a courtroom. Gloria Jordan was 55 and had raised 4 kids, buried a husband, and kept her phone charged at all times because in this family, something was always happening. She was the node through which all Jordan family information passed. Not a gossip exactly, but a keeper. She had a way of knowing things without being told them, and a habit of saying the right thing 3 weeks after you needed to hear it. The backyard was loud and warm and full of people Caleb had known his whole life. Cousins, neighbors, his father, Earl Jordan, 6'2", broad-shouldered, with a voice that carried across the yard without effort. Big Earl, everyone called him, though never to underestimate him. He'd spent 32 years working at a logistics company before a back injury retired him early, and those 32 years had calcified certain beliefs into something close to gospel. A man provided, a man led, a man did not allow the people around him to outpace him and call it fine. Big Earl had opinions about Danny's promotion. He hadn't stated them out loud, not yet, but Caleb had felt them, in the way his father looked at him at the dinner table, in the questions that weren't quite asked. At the cookout, someone, Caleb never found out who, told the story of Danny's promotion to the back porch crowd. And Danny lit up the way she always did when talking about work, and people laughed and raised their cups. And Caleb's cousin Deshaun said, "Girl, you're out here running Atlanta," and everyone agreed. Caleb flipped burgers and smiled. He was good at the smile. Later, his father found him by the cooler. "You good?" Big Earl asked. The question meant more than it sounded. Caleb said he was fine. Big Earl looked at him for a long moment. Then, quietly, almost gently, which was its own kind of warning, he said, "A man who can't provide is just a guest in his own house, son. You remember that." He clapped Caleb on the shoulder and walked away. Caleb stood there with a cold drink in his hand and felt something old and ugly settle into him like a splinter he couldn't reach. He didn't know it then, but his father's words would soon find their way into every corner of his life, into his marriage, into his choices, into a decision that would cost him far more than he could calculate standing by that cooler. September came in hot, the way Atlanta Septembers do, like summer refusing to take the hint. Danny's boss was a woman named Naomi Kessler, 45, the kind of executive who wore the same expression whether she was approving a budget or ordering lunch. Calm, decisive, slightly ahead of wherever the conversation was. Naomi had been watching Danny for 2 years. She recognized a certain kind of intelligence, not just the marketing instincts, but the way Danny read a room, held a team together, made hard calls without flinching, the kind of intelligence that got wasted if it stayed in the same place too long. So, in the second week of September, Naomi called Danny into her office and laid it out. The company was opening a regional hub in Chicago. They needed a director to build the operation from the ground up. The salary would be $83,000, nearly 20 more than Danny was making. Full relocation package, 18-month contract with a permanent offer option at the end. Danny thanked her and said she'd think about it. She walked out of that office and sat in the stairwell for 11 minutes. She called her mother first. Patricia Webb was 57 and had spent the better part of her adult life making sure her daughter had options she hadn't. She was sharp, principled, and had never fully warmed to Caleb, not because she disliked him as a person, but because she'd done the math early and come to a conclusion she kept mostly to herself. She listened to Danny describe the offer. She asked 2 questions. "What's the salary? And does Caleb know yet?" When Danny said no, Patricia said, "Good. Figure out what you want first." Danny figured out what she wanted. She wanted both, the job and her marriage. What she didn't know yet was whether those 2 things were still pointing in the same direction. She told Caleb on a Wednesday night over takeout. She laid it out carefully, the money, the opportunity, the timeline, the fact that she hadn't said yes. She framed it as something they would decide together. The fight that followed was not their worst, but it was their most honest. Caleb said he wasn't moving to Chicago. He said it without yelling, which somehow made it worse. Danny said she hadn't asked him to move. She'd asked him to think about it. He said there was nothing to think about. She said that was exactly the problem. By the next morning, the whole family knew. Not because either of them had called anyone, but because Danny had mentioned it to Simone, and Simone had a way of caring so hard about Danny that information traveled in her wake without her meaning it to. And Caleb had come home to find his best friend Marco waiting in the parking lot. Marco Lawson was 31, a subcontractor who did renovation work across Atlanta. He was the kind of friend who'd been there since high school, since before the warehouse job, before Danny, before any of it. He was loyal in the way people are loyal before they've ever been tested. Caleb would come to think about that distinction a great deal in the months ahead. Marco told Caleb to hold his ground, told him Danny was getting too big for where they were. Used the word her people in a way that landed badly, though neither of them acknowledged it. Caleb didn't totally agree, but he didn't push back either. He needed someone in his corner, and Marco had always fit that shape. Meanwhile, at a Sunday dinner that nobody had planned to be a forum, Patricia made a comment about men who hold women back, and Gloria made a comment about women who don't consult their husbands. And within 40 minutes, there were group chats that had been split, alliances that had been declared, and at least 2 people who'd left the table without finishing their food. Gloria, trying to defend Caleb during a side conversation with Patricia, accidentally said, "That boy has been saving every cent. His daddy even borrowed from the house fund a few months back, and I know Caleb doesn't even know yet." October hit Caleb from 3 directions at once. The first, his manager pulled him into HR on a Monday morning. There had been complaints. Attendance gaps documented. Inventory errors logged. His co-worker Derek Holt, 34, a man who wore ambition like a cologne he'd applied too heavily, had been quietly building a file for weeks. Derek wanted Caleb's supervisor position. He'd decided the most efficient path to it was through Caleb, rather than around him. Caleb was placed on a 60-day performance review. The second, the furniture side hustle had earned him a total of $640 in 3 months. After materials, that was $211 in profit. He'd budgeted for $1,200. The third, he checked the savings account. The balance was $9,980. It should have been $14,200, minus the $680 he'd deposited himself, which meant approximately $3,540 was unaccounted for. He sat with his phone in his hand for a long time. He thought about the joint account rules they'd agreed on. Both names, any withdrawal over $500 requires a conversation. He thought about Danny, and for one dark moment, he hated himself for where his mind went. He pulled up the transaction history. The withdrawals had come in 2 installments, March and April, both from an ATM he didn't recognize in a neighborhood he didn't know. Caleb drove to his father's house. Big Earl answered the door in a bathrobe and knew immediately why his son was standing there. He didn't make Caleb ask. He sat him down in the kitchen and told him. There had been a poker game, a run of bad luck, a loan from someone who had not been patient about repayment. Earl had panicked. He'd had access to the account, a leftover permission from when he'd helped them set it up, and he'd taken $4,200. He'd planned to put it back before Caleb ever noticed. He had not put it back. He'd put back $660, which is why the math hadn't lined up cleanly. I was going to tell you, Earl said. He was a big man who suddenly looked very small. Caleb sat across from his father and felt something shift in him. Not just anger, though there was plenty of that. He left without saying much. He drove. He ended up on Marco's street without fully deciding to go there. Marco's apartment was on the second floor of a walk-up in Kirkwood. He didn't recognize the other. He stood there. He listened. He heard Marco say a name he hadn't expected to hear. Danny's. He heard the older voice say, "She doesn't know, and it needs to stay that way." He heard Marco say, "I'm done with this. I've been done." He heard the older voice say, "You were done the day you took the money. That's not how this works." Caleb stood at that door for 3 full minutes. Then he knocked. The man sitting in Marco's kitchen was Franklin Webb, Danny's uncle, retired banker, 62 years old. A man who had, 4 years ago, approached Marco Lawson, broke, young, hungry, with a simple proposition. Watch Caleb Jordan. Report back on whether he was stable, whether he was the kind of man worthy of Danielle. He'd paid Marco $3,000 over 6 months. Marco had told himself it was harmless. He'd told himself he stopped reporting. But Franklin had never let go of the arrangement. And recently, he'd come back to use it. Caleb sat down at Marco's kitchen table. Franklin Webb tried to introduce himself as though they'd never intersected before. Caleb looked at him, then looked at Marco. Marco told him everything. Not because he was particularly brave, because the weight of carrying it had finally exceeded the weight of confessing it. He'd been paid to watch Caleb. He'd stopped, or mostly stopped. But Franklin had come back 2 months ago, after the Chicago offer surfaced, and told Marco to encourage Caleb to let Danny go, to push him toward accepting the move, or at least not fighting it. If Marco didn't cooperate, Franklin would tell Caleb about the original arrangement, which is how Marco had ended up at that cookout insisting Caleb hold his ground. Not out of loyalty, but because Franklin had told him that if Caleb resisted Chicago hard enough, Danny would eventually choose her husband over the job, which was what Franklin wanted. Franklin wanted Danny to turn it down. He'd decided the move was risky for reasons that had everything to do with his own calculations about Danny's future and nothing to do with what Danny herself wanted. Caleb listened to all of this. He did not yell. He did not throw anything. He stood up, shook his head slowly, and walked out of Marco's apartment without looking at either of them. He drove home. Danny was awake, laptop open, working. She looked up when he came in, and she could tell immediately that something had broken. She closed the laptop. They talked for 2 hours. The most honest 2 hours they'd had in months, maybe years. He told her about his father. He told her about the side hustle. He told her about the performance review. He told her all of it, everything except Franklin. He was still holding that. He needed to know, first, whether she already knew. Danny, for her part, told him she hadn't accepted Chicago. She told him she hadn't said no either. She told him she was scared. Not of the job, but of a version of their life where they stopped telling each other the truth. They didn't fix anything that night, but they stopped pretending there was nothing to fix. Caleb kissed her and told her he was glad they'd talked. She smiled and said goodnight and went to charge her phone on the nightstand. He lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling. Then her phone lit up. He wasn't trying to look. He just happened to see it, the way you sometimes see things you can't unsee. The name on the screen, Simone. The preview of the message. Did you tell him yet? He deserves to know about... The screen locked. He didn't wake her up. He didn't confront her that night. That was not who Caleb Jordan was, or at least not who he was working to become. He waited. He left for work in the morning. He called in his first personal day in 8 months. He drove. He parked in a lot near the Beltline and just sat there for a while, doing the math he kept doing, trying to make the numbers tell him something different. Then he called his Aunt Gloria. Gloria came and found him. She did not need to be told twice. She brought coffee and did not ask him how he was doing. She could see how he was doing. Instead, she started talking, which was what she did when she understood that a person needed information more than comfort. "I'm going to tell you some things," she said, "and you're not going to like them. And when I'm done, you're going to understand that I should have told you sooner, and I didn't, and I'm sorry." She told him about Simone. Simone Blake was 30, Danny's closest friend at work, a woman who'd navigated more than most people knew. She'd worked, years before her current job, as an analyst at a boutique investment bank in Buckhead, the same bank where Franklin Webb had worked before his retirement. She'd left that job 2 years ago and taken her current position partly to get away from what she'd seen there. What she'd seen, a series of quiet, off-book transactions, loans structured as consulting fees, investments that benefited certain clients without clear documentation. Nothing that would make the front page, but enough that a careful analyst noticed. She'd kept records. She hadn't known what to do with them. Then she'd met Danny, and slowly, over lunches, over shared work travel, over the kind of friendship that builds in the gaps of professional life, she'd put it together. Years ago, when Danny's firm was struggling to get off the ground, Franklin Webb had quietly co-signed a loan, structured through his bank, below the radar, to seed the company's early operating costs. The firm that Danny had joined, grown inside, climbed through. Its survival in those first 2 years had been quietly underwritten by her uncle. Danny had no idea. She'd applied for that job on her own, gotten it on her own, earned every promotion on her own. But the soil she'd grown in had been fertilized by a man who'd decided to protect her without telling her. Caleb sat with this for a long time. He thought about the cookout, about the way the table had leaned toward Danny, about the number his father had put in his head. A man who can't provide is just a guest. About all the months he'd spent feeling behind, feeling insufficient, feeling like the gap between them was a verdict on him. And he thought about the fact that the gap had not been entirely real. Not because Danny wasn't talented, she was, immensely, but because the field hadn't been flat, because Franklin had tilted it, quietly, without anyone's consent, and the tilt had looked like distance, and Caleb had spent the better part of a year trying to run faster on a slope he didn't know was there. Gloria watched him process it. She didn't rush him. Finally, he said, "Does Danny know?" "Simone has been trying to figure out how to tell her for 3 weeks, Gloria said. That's what the message was about. Caleb called Danny and asked her to meet him for lunch. She heard something in his voice and left the office early. They sat in a diner they'd been to 100 times, a booth in the back, the kind of place with vinyl seats and sweet tea that came without asking. He told her everything he knew. He told her about Franklin and Marco. He told her about the loan. He told her what Gloria had told him, and what Simone had been trying to find the courage to say. Danny was quiet for a long time, not the quiet of someone who had nothing to say, the quiet of someone sorting through too many things to say them all at once. Finally, "He thought he was helping me." "I know," Caleb said. "I didn't ask him to." "I know." She looked at him across the table, and for the first time in a very long time, there was nothing between them. No scoreboard, no performance. No carefully managed version of themselves. "I need to talk to him," she said. The conversation between Danny and Franklin Webb happened at his house in Stone Mountain on a Saturday afternoon. Caleb didn't come. She didn't want a witness. She wanted a confrontation, and those go better without an audience. Franklin was not a villain. That was the hardest part. He was a man who had loved his niece imperfectly, who had confused protection with control, who genuinely could not see the difference between giving someone a chance and deciding their chances for them. He cried. He apologized in the way people apologize when they don't fully understand what they did wrong but understand they've caused pain. Danny told him she loved him, and that what he'd done was not okay, and that she needed time. She drove home with her hands very steady on the wheel. Meanwhile, at the warehouse, something Caleb hadn't expected. The HR investigation into his performance found, in the process of reviewing documentation, a pattern of bad faith complaints originating from Derek Holt. It turned out Derek had done this before, at a previous job. A colleague of Caleb's named Jerome, who'd watched the whole thing unfold and said nothing for too long, came forward with records he'd kept. Caleb's review was closed. Derek was placed on notice. Caleb called Jerome afterward and said thank you. Jerome said, "I should have done it sooner." Caleb said he understood the feeling. Big Earl called and asked to come over for dinner. He showed up with a cashier's check for the full $4,200. Money he'd borrowed from his sister, who'd made him promise to apologize properly before giving it to him. He sat at their kitchen table and apologized to both of them, which was more than Caleb had expected, and exactly what Danny had needed to see. It didn't fix everything, but it was the right kind of gesture, at the right kind of time. Marco sent a letter. 3 pages, handwritten. He'd driven past the apartment twice before deciding to mail it instead of knocking. Caleb read it once and put it in the kitchen drawer. He didn't write back. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But he didn't throw it away either. That felt like the honest choice. Danny turned down Chicago. Not because Caleb asked her to. He hadn't asked her to do anything. He'd specifically told her that he would figure out Chicago if that's what she needed. She turned it down because she wanted to rebuild something here, on her own terms, in a city she knew, in a life she was choosing. Naomi accepted her decision with more grace than Danny had expected and told her the door remained open. Danny said she appreciated that and meant it. The house fund had been at $9,980. They rebuilt it. It took longer than the spreadsheet said, and the spreadsheet had 3 revisions before they stopped consulting it and just started living. By the following spring, they had over $17,000. Not enough for the house yet, but enough to prove they were still building something. One evening in late March, Caleb came home from a Saturday of errands and found Danny in the living room, reading, with the early spring light coming through the windows at that particular angle that makes Atlanta look golden. He went to the bedroom to put away his coat. He opened the bottom drawer of the nightstand. He wasn't sure why, old habit, and found his furniture notebook, the one he'd been keeping since before they were married. Sketches of pieces he wanted to build, wood types, stain formulas, measurements. He sat on the edge of the bed and flipped through it for a while. Then he smiled, put it back in the drawer. Not tucked away, within reach. In the living room, Danny looked up when he came back in. She could tell something had shifted. She asked what he was smiling at. He sat down next to her. Close. Nothing, he said. I just remembered something I'm good at. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him the first time she understood she was going to marry this man. Then she went back to her book. Outside, Atlanta kept going. It always did,